The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Karen McGovern with the Division of Professions and Occupations. It looks like we only have 2 people signed on, but I also want to be respectful of your time to the 2 people who are signed on. So thought we might go ahead and get started, and hopefully a few more people will join as we kind of work through the process. We are here today for the Office of Naturopathic Doctor Registration to have a stakeholder meeting and talk about the legislative changes that are coming to fruition this fall, specifically the Naturopathic Doctor Sunset Bill 2012, but also a couple of other pieces of legislation that will impact this program. Let me first introduce staff that is online to help facilitate the meeting. We have Laura Bravo, who's a policy analyst with the division, and Zen Mayhew, who is the program director for the Office of Naturopathic Doctor Registration. I'm going to start with the other bills before we do the Sunset Bill. First, we have Colorado House Bill 20-1326, which is called the Red Tape Reduction Bill, and directs the division to create an occupational credentialing program to remove barriers to licensure by endorsement. Through that bill, we will have a streamlined process for endorsement, and which will involve looking at substantially equivalent experience and credentials, and what that means when we have someone coming in who is licensed or registered in another state or United States territory or foreign country. Another aspect of that bill is the military spouse piece, and through that bill, military spouses will be eligible to have a temporary registration for 3 years if their spouse is stationed in Colorado as part of their military assignment. The next bill I wanted to just give a brief overview of is Colorado Senate Bill 20-102. That bill requires healthcare providers to disclose instances of discipline or criminal conviction for sexual offenses. That bill relates to anyone who is registered under this program by virtue of the definition of healthcare provider in the bill, and requires that the licensees or registrants provide a written disclosure to the patient prior to providing services. The patient has to acknowledge that the disclosure has been made and that they agree to the treatment. This disclosure period is required during the time that the registrant is serving a sentence for the criminal conviction or plea of guilty, which could be parole or probation, or any time that the person is on probation for a disciplinary action, or their license has some kind of limitation, restriction, or condition. Once they have successfully completed their criminal sentence, or they have successfully completed their disciplinary term with the board or the program, then they are no longer required to make the disclosure. The third bill that I wanted to talk about is the Sunset Bill, House Bill 20-1212. I have that up on my screen and have gone through here and highlighted some of the big changes. I think the first thing to note is that the regulation of the profession was extended through September 1st of 2029. There were some changes that were made to the program as it relates to the director and consultants and investigators, and that is the immunity clause. There were changes made to the makeup of the Naturopathic Medicine Advisory Committee, so requiring that now one of the 3 members who are physicians have to be a pediatrician, and another of those three has to be a member of a statewide multi-specialty medical society. So that's not going to require changes to the rules, but definitely something I wanted to highlight that we will be working to implement in the next couple of months. The advisory committee, there's now a requirement that they meet at least once a year, and they added other specific duties to what they should accomplish during the meeting. And I've highlighted them here. Looks like there might be a question. It looks like there's
Ann McGeehan had some questions.
Yeah, the questions, we wanted to know who and when we should submit names to the advisory, and that's certainly something that you can start doing now. You can send them to the inbox for the program, or you can send them directly to me at karen.mcgovern@state.co.us. One of the things that the committee will now be doing is making recommendation to the director on whether or not there should be additions to the formulary. And it looks like there were examples of things that are possible additions for the director to consider. Changes, these look like they're just sort of wording changes, just non-technical as we go through here. And then they did add, so the section talks about, sorry, I have to collapse this. The practice of naturopathic medicine includes, and they added another provision that says, obtaining and administering any additions to the naturopathic formulary as determined by the director by rule. They do limit it to biological substances, including vitamins, minerals, I don't know how to nutritive substances, extracts, and their products and residues. And that is it. So there were not a lot of substantive changes through the sunset bill. And by that, let me clarify, I mean changes that will necessarily be reflected in the rules that we're going to look at this point. I would encourage anyone who has questions or feedback to raise your hand, and we will call on you so that you can provide your feedback. And while that's going on, I'm going to change my screen so I can pull up some rules to look at.
And Karen, it looks like Ann McGeehan had some additional questions that she submitted.
Okay.
And if you want to go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Otherwise, I'm going to start reading through your comments. There we go. I'll just let you go ahead and share. You'll probably be better at than I am. And if you unmute your line, you can speak. Looks like your line is still there. You go, Ann. Go ahead.
Great. Sorry. It's not Zoom, so I have to look around. On behalf, I'm the contract lobbyist for the Colorado Association of Naturopathic Doctors. And when the bill was in the legislature, we made specific changes. We requested specific changes to 12-250-106 to remove the language of obtaining, dispensing, and administering, because pharmacies believed that we were not able to obtain those listed drugs and items because the rules and the statute only said obtaining and administering. So we removed them, and so that the NDs can now prescribe them and therefore obtain them from pharmacies. That is a big, big change.
Okay, appreciate that.
And we're looking for some rules, particularly, if I'm looking at the existing rules under 1.7, the naturopathic formulary 1.7b of the current rules, that would have to be updated, the entire 1.7, because of the removal of obtaining, administering. language, which has confused the pharmacies in the past.
Okay.
Nice to hear your voice, Karen.
It's good to hear you too. Anything else? Any other rules while you're on that you wanted to address?
And then we were wondering if you were going to do rules around the functioning of the advisory committee.
So
In terms, yeah.
So that's typically not something we do. When you think about rules, rules aren't made to bind the advisory committee. Rules are to give clarity to licensees and talk about how, about practice and things of that nature. But we definitely could consider a policy if that's something that you would like to see written up.
Well, we will take what you said under advisement and consider whether or not we would want a policy. And I know you were present for the testimony on the advisory committee and the need for the naturopaths to work with the physicians and through that advisory committee.
Absolutely, and I think that that's something that we will definitely work on. And something that, you know, the committee can work on and get some of these, address some of the items that were expressly put in the statute, and definitely something that we are implementing. I think our push right now is to make sure that we're getting the rules in place that we need to get in place before we start the committee work, and then making sure that we get the right people seated on the committee.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to mute before my dogs start barking.
Okay. So does anybody else have any suggested rules or anything they want to talk about before I go through and talk about what rule changes might be necessary to implement the new statutes?
I don't see any other hands or comments right now.
Okay, so I'm just scrolling through here. And looking, and don't see any of the changes. Anne brought up a good point, making sure that we make the formulary rule consistent with the new statute. This, we're talking about the CE here, the renewal of the registration, military exemption, reinstatement, treatment of children. Okay, so here is a new rule that we are proposing to be added. We talked a little bit about Colorado Senate Bill 20-102, and this piece of legislation actually requires that rules be made. The statute itself is actually pretty detailed, and most of what is contained in these rules is from the statute. We did make a couple of clarifying statements. I think the first thing to keep in mind is that these disclosures are required starting March 1st of 2021. I think that another piece that I've been highlighting for the professions is that it has to be a written disclosure. We have a sample model disclosure, and I'll scroll down to that so you can see it. The statute did specifically require that there be a model disclosure. There's not a requirement through the Practice Act that your disclosure needs to look exactly like this, but really should, it's put in place so that licensees understand what needs to be in the disclosure. And so it goes through and it's pretty detailed. I mean, it has to have the name and number of the licensee. a listing of any final conviction, and then for each conviction, there's all these requirements. You know, the date that the conviction was entered, the nature of the offense, the type and scope of the sentence or other penalty. Then it's the same thing for any final agency action by a professional regulatory board or agency. That is any action that results in probationary status or other limitation on the licensee's ability to practice. And again, then for each action, they have to provide all the details. The date that the final agency action was issued, but most importantly, they have to include the contact information for the professional regulatory board or agency that imposed the final agency action. The other piece that was very important in the legislation was that there be a sample signature block to make sure that all the appropriate signatures were obtained. The other piece about this legislation is that the statute expressly requires that the disclosure be made at the time the patient makes the appointment. So not wanting to wait until the patient was in the office to make the disclosure. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that. So if you are a licensee or registrant that takes walk-in appointments, it's just required that you make the disclosure prior to providing any treatment. If you are a provider that has follow-up visits with the same patient, you only need make the disclosure once unless any information in that form changes. The other piece to remember that's important is once you have completed your sentence and you're no longer on probation or parole, or you're no longer subject to disciplinary probation or terms for your license, you don't have to make the disclosure. Like, you get to stop making the disclosure at that point. And then there are exceptions. And normally I would just refer people to the statute, but because this is so detailed, we went ahead and popped them in the rule as well. It talks about you don't have to make the disclosure if the patient is unconscious or otherwise unable to comprehend the disclosure, and there is not a guardian available. I've been trying to make sure that we understand that unable to comprehend would refer to their cognitive ability. We have a lot of professions who perhaps optometrists provide eyeglasses, and I don't think you get to say you're not making the disclosure because someone can't see. Or if you are doing somebody who, if you're providing services as a hearing aid provider or audiologist, I don't think you get to use the loophole that they can't hear as unable to comprehend. And so maybe we need to add more clarity, and that's something that we can look at. If the visit occurs in an emergency room or freestanding emergency department, or in an inpatient facility. So in those instances, a disclosure is not required. A disclosure isn't required if you don't even know that you're going to see the patient until the visit is happening. So I think that pertains, if you think about professions like surgical assistants or surgical technologists, who sometimes are assigned to a surgery and the patient's already, under anesthesia before they get in there. And then the last one is if the licensee does not have a direct treatment relationship or have direct contact with the patient. I don't believe, I know I have a good example of that, and pharmacists are part of the healthcare profession that have to make this disclosure. And in some instances, a pharmacist may be providing a patient service by filling a prescription at a location where the patient doesn't have access. Or they may never see the patient. And I think that kind of is a good example of why this exception is in place. But we want to make sure that people don't misunderstand this exception to mean that the disclosure doesn't have to be made during telehealth visits, because you still do have a direct treatment relationship, or you have direct contact with the patient, even though it is through a virtual medium. So with all that being said, which was a huge mouthful, does anybody have any feedback or questions on this piece?
Anne McGeehan asked, no disclosure is required if no sexual misconduct, correct?
That's correct. And so if I forgot that piece, I'm sorry. I've given this spiel so many times that now I can't even remember if I said it today. Right, the disclosure, all of this only relates to discipline or a conviction for sexual misconduct. And essentially, if you think about the bill, the purpose or the intent, as you read it, is that they want to make sure that patients have the opportunity to choose. And so if your provider does have a history of sexual misconduct and they are, have a conviction or they've had their professional license disciplined, then the patient has the opportunity to know about it and then to choose whether or not to continue treatment.
Okay, that was the only question I'd received so far, and there's no hands raised.
Okay. So any other questions about the sunset or the other bills or the rules? Happy to take those now and address them. Okay. I don't see anything. Do you have anything, Laura?
Nope, I don't have any further comments or hands raised.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about next steps. And so I'm going to turn my screen off so I can find my calendar so I can talk about dates. So if you just bear with me for a couple of minutes here. Working from home, I only have one screen, and so I have to kind of maneuver between tabs. Okay, so naturopathic doctors are scheduled for rulemaking on these matters on September 30th at 9 a.m. It will be another virtual meeting just like this one. We will file the proposed rules with the Secretary of State on Monday. They will be in the register on September 15th. We will send you a notice, all stakeholders and all licensees, registrants of this profession will send a notice that has the time and the date and the login information for the rulemaking hearing on September 30th. Any questions about that?
We did have a question from Anne McGeehan. Are you filing the rules this Monday without a correction to 1.7?
We will make the correction to 1.7 as you suggested. We'll take the comments from today. We will make the corrections, and then we will, after we file with the Secretary of State, we will circle back with you before the rulemaking hearing on September 30th to see if you have any feedback based on that correction.
Okay, she says thanks.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, I really appreciate your participation and you engaging with us kind of in this early stakeholder forum before we actually file the rules. And then again, I will circle back with you once we have a copy of what we're filing with the Secretary of State so that we can talk through any other suggestions that you might have prior to the rulemaking hearing. Everybody stay safe and have a good weekend. Thank you.